Alrighty. So the first thing that I want to talk about is adding feet. So if you look at some of these tiles that are already done, we can deduce that feet are going to go where? On the bottom. So you think about, you're going to see this happen a lot in ceramics. We're going to talk about what sound like our own body parts, and they're going to appear in basically the same places in our ceramic projects as on our body. So feet are always at the bottom, unless you're doing a handstand, which our tiles are not going to be, so they're going to be on the bottom. And the reason that we're going to add feet to our tiles, first of all, it gives it a little bit more of a finished look. It's not just a flat slab of clay with a picture on it anymore. It's just a little more finished. It picks it up off the table a little bit. And then what that also does, so what you're going to notice as your clay is drying out and getting a little bit harder, think of it like a grape. So if you pick a grape fresh off the vine, fresh off the grocery store vine, and it's really nice and plump and crispy and it tastes really good, right? If you were to let it sit on the table just out, or maybe in the sun perhaps, for a long period of time, what happens to a grape? What does it become? It becomes a raisin. It shrivels up and it becomes a raisin. So clay kind of does that too. It just doesn't shrivel, but when the moisture leaves your clay, it actually shrinks a little bit. And so then what can happen as your clay shrinks, and as you measure it as it's drying, you'll notice that it's getting smaller. Our clay is going to shrink maybe 1/2 inch-ish. And what also can happen, if it's just a flat slab with nothing attached to it, it can warp, and so then it won't sit flat anymore. So when we add the feet to it, it kind of gives it something that it's attached to, and it won't warp anymore, okay? So that's the other reason that we're going to attach feet, so that our tiles actually stay as nice, flat, solid tiles, okay? Couple of things that we need to keep in mind when we're attaching feet is thickness. What do we need to keep in mind as far as thickness goes? 1/4 inch. So you'll notice I've got 4 different types of feet here. You can make them however you want. These 3 tiles were all part of the same set, but they all have different feet, and that's totally fine with me, as long as they're that 1/4 inch thickness. They keep your tile up off the table. And then the other thing that you want to think about, once you get your feet on there, you want to make sure that your tile is still even and still solid and steady, okay? So if you put your feet on there and then you're kind of pushing on your tile and it's just like wobbling all around, we've kind of defeated the purpose of the feet, right? So you want it to be able to stay sturdy, and you also still want it to be nice and flat. If you would like to turn up the edges a little bit, if you want it to be more of like a little dish, that's fine with me. But overall, we still want it to sit nice and even, okay? So I want to show you a couple feet things. So we're keeping thickness in mind. So what if I did this for a foot? How would you guys feel about that? Would you say, that's great, Mrs. Fowler, let's leave that?
No.
Why? What are the problems? It's way too thick. This would explode in the kiln. Okay, so maybe you do want that prominent of a foot. So instead, maybe I'm gonna take my little ribbon tool and carve it out a little bit. So keep in mind that 1/4 inch thickness. Okay, maybe I'm gonna pinch into it with my thumb a little bit. Just make sure that it's 1/4 inch. And then what if I attach it like that? Is that then okay? If I had obviously 3 more of them and it sat flat, then that's okay, right? Because the thickness all over is no more than about 1/4 inch, okay? So if you want a pretty if you want a big foot, just make sure that overall it's about 1/4 inch thickness, okay? I did put up the PowerPoint slide from the PowerPoint that you've already seen that has a couple different feet. The other one that I see a lot, if you want to make a snake of clay, you could do a snake of clay like this one and maybe put it in the middle, or maybe you're gonna put it around each edge, okay? So thickness is something that we need to keep in mind, and then we also wanna keep in mind, anytime we're attaching one piece of clay to another, what do we have to do? We have to score and slip it. So if I were to take this coil, this snake, and just kind of push it on here, it may stay for the time that my clay is soft, but because I put a smooth surface against a smooth surface, as my clay dries, it's gonna pop right off. It's not gonna stay. So the reason that we slip and score is to make a rough surface, add that slip like the glue to attach it. So if I were gonna attach that coil, that snake on the edge, I'm gonna score both. So remember, you've got your scoring tool. You can also use a needle tool as long as you rough up that surface pretty well. Think Velcro. Score both, and then we just need slip on the one. And remember, you want nice spreadable slip. It's like the glue. And then I would go ahead and wiggle that on, okay? Also really important that we are making sure to do all of our attachments when our clay is what state or softer? Leather hard or softer. So if your tiles have gotten beyond leather hard, could I add feet? No. Okay, so make sure that you're keeping your clay leather hard or softer. Okay, and honestly, I would wait until you're at leather hard. If you add feet and your tile's still really soft, when you flip it over, it may want to kind of droop and not sit flat. So those are the main things with feet. Any other questions with the feet? Make sure that you're keeping track of your thickness, you're slipping and scoring, and that the tile is staying nice and even once you attach, okay? Okay, now moving on to smoothing techniques. So I know I've gotten a lot of questions. How do I clean the little boogers, I call them clay boogers, out of my carving lines? How do I get everything really nice and smooth? How do I clean up around my attachments? How do I clean up in my little piercings? So first of all, if your clay is not leather hard, if it's softer than leather hard, don't even start with your finishing touches. It's just gonna keep making a mess. You really want your clay to be leather hard, and even on the far end of leather hard. Otherwise, you're just gonna keep digging into that soft clay and it's gonna keep making more and more boogers, okay? But if you are at leather hard, hopefully you kind of did this as you went, but we wanna kind of keep smoothing. So I'm gonna smooth up the edges. You can still tap if you need to clean up your square, make it a little more square. Okay, so remember, always a damp sponge because we're not trying to make the surface slimy. If you do have any smooth areas, your sponge or your finger. Now what we don't want to do, we don't want to make the surface slimy. So I always have a student who wants to start using slip on the surface because in your head you think that's smooth, it's going to make it smooth. But if you think of slip as your glue, are you ever going to put a bunch of glue on a piece of paper to make it look better? No. So we don't want to add our glue to our surface if we're not attaching anything to it. So dry finger is good. Very damp sponge is good. Paintbrush, if you're trying to get close to maybe one of your carving lines, you can use your paintbrush. Okay? But we just don't want to make the surface super slimy, okay? And then as far as your carving lines go, if you used a needle tool to carve and you want to keep your lines that thin, we want to keep with the needle tool. However, rather than using the point where it's sharper and it's going to keep digging into your clay, you want to kind of turn it and almost use the side of the needle tool because we're not trying to dig in anymore. We're just trying to kind of pick up those clay boogers and clean them out. So, in the carving lines here, I'm going to kind of hold my needle tool to the side and pull it through. I'm not applying very much pressure at all because the second that I carve deeper, it's going to pull clay out of the surface. So I'm really just trying to go through that line and clean it up. If you have a line that has a little bit bigger boogers, they might come off on your needle tool as you pull it through. the second that your needle tool picks up a booger, it's going to be teeny tiny, but pull your needle tool out of the surface and clean that off of there. Otherwise, it's just going to keep going down into your carving line, okay? So it's tedious, but it's worth it. So we're using the side of the needle tool. We're not applying very much pressure, and we're cleaning the boogers off as soon as they attach themselves to the needle tool. Okay, so I'm going to clean up a couple here and then show you the difference. The other thing that you can do once you've gone through and gotten them as clean as you think you can also take a little paintbrush through them. Okay, so once I kind of clean up these lines, I'm going to take a paintbrush through, and I'm going to use a little guy. So there's plenty of different paintbrushes over there. Just like with the sponge, I don't want it sopping wet, and then you can kind of take your paintbrush through and it'll just kind of clean up the edges a little bit, and it'll get everything looking a little bit more even. I'm going to show you guys this here in just a second. Okay, but again, just like with everything else that I've said, you don't want to make the surface slimy. So we're just using this as a final go through to get those finishing touches. Okay, so I'm cleaning I'm kind of getting the excess water off the brush before I touch it to the surface. Okay, fingers are good too. If you kind of take your finger and pull it away from the carving, sometimes when you carve, it makes clay raised up on either side of that. If you take your finger and kind of pull it away from the carving, that can help too. Okay, so I'll show you what I've cleaned up against what hasn't been cleaned up yet. You can tell me if you think it looks better. Okay, so this area down here, I've cleaned up. Does it look better than some of the other carving lines? Okay, I know it's hard to see from far away. I'm happy to come help you guys individually, but I cleaned up that part. So that was using the side of the needle tool and then paintbrush, okay? If you have an area that you carved in and maybe you carved it a little bit too early and so it's just like a disaster, you might take a damp sponge just kind of over the whole thing, just very lightly, not take it off of there, just to get some of the surface crumbs off, and then go through with your side of your needle tool. If you have piercings, so we've got some piercings here, the edge of a needle tool, so I'm going to put it all the way through and then just basically use the edge of it to kind of rub it against the piercing. That can help smooth it out, especially if you can't get your little fingers in there. Again, paintbrush is going to be helpful in piercings as well. Okay, so if you can get a paintbrush in there, and then you can just use your finger to kind of pull away from the piercing if there's any excess clay. Okay, on this tile I wanted to show you a couple things. She had some areas where it got pretty close to the edge and it's cracking quite a bit. Okay, it's not wanting to stay together because there's not a whole lot of clay connected right there. What you can do in that situation is take a fresh small piece of clay, and you can do this kind of around or on the back, but I'm actually going to slip and score a piece of clay around that crack to kind of reinforce it. Sometimes once clay cracks, it has muscle memory, and so even if you smooth it back together, it's still weak at that spot, and so it's going to want to keep cracking. So I'm just going to slip and score all around that little crack, okay? And then we'll smooth it in so it looks like it never happened. Okay, so there won't be a big bulky piece of clay there, I'll show you. So I'm gonna kind of wrap that piece of clay around and smooth it in. And then she can kind of redo her carvings there. And that'll kind of reinforce so that there's not that weak spot there anymore. Okay, so if you're having that issue, you just maybe got a little too close to the edge, that's what I would do there. As far as around your additions, double-ended rubber tool is one of my favorites. It'll get you into those crevices if you're having trouble getting around where you added clay. If you have thicker carved lines, the double-ended rubber tool is also good for smoothing. Since it's not as sharp as the needle tool, sometimes it just automatically makes a nicer line. And then a paintbrush can also be really nice for getting around some of your additions, okay? So finger, paintbrush, sponge, double-ended rubber tool. If you're having trouble with a specific area, call me over. Just make sure that you're leather hard or even a little bit past, as long as everything's already attached on, to start your final touch-ups, okay? Final touch-ups and craftsmanship are something that I grade fairly hard on. I'm a little bit softer on this first project, but it's something that I think everybody is very capable of. So we want to make sure that we're getting those final touches. I think it can take a good design and a good project to great, okay? To have those finishing touches, all your line quality looks really even and smooth, and it just looks really nice. The edges of your tiles are all nice and squared. I do look at the back, so we want everything to look really nice. So if there's a specific area that you're having trouble with, especially if you weren't like right here, let me know. I'm happy to help you individually, but we do want to make sure that we take it to the next level as far as craftsmanship goes. Okay? Questions? All right, get to it.